Now that we've had a chance to texture with 2D procedural maps, I wanted to talk about bitmaps. 2D procedural textures are great for anything that's more organic and noisy, anything that might repeat without a very specific pattern. However, 2D procedural textures are not good for anything that's very specific. For example, if you wanted lettering to appear on something, or a very specific stripe, or a hatch, or a ridge, or a edge of something, procedural textures would not be good at that. That's where you want to use a bitmap instead. And bitmaps are basically images you bring in from disk. You might create those images by taking a digital photo, or you might create one from scratch by painting something in Photoshop, or a combination of both where you take a photo and you adapt it inside Photoshop. In any case, it's an image that's saved to disk as a JPEG or a TIFF or Targa or some other image format. So to demonstrate that, I brought in this tire model. And this model saved out as tire.mb in the Chapter 9 folder. It's in Chapter 9 because we're going to return to this to discuss UVs. In fact, it's necessary to prepare the UV layout of any custom or complex model before you apply a custom bitmap. UVs basically determine how a map is laid across a surface when it's textured. And when you have something very specific like a custom bitmap that might have, say, the lettering or the label or the stripe, you have to make sure that the UVs are correct first. In any case, we're going to talk about UVs in great detail in future videos. For now, we'll just assume the UVs are correct on this tire and have been prepared. So we can go straight to bringing in the bitmap. So I'm going to go to the hypershade. And the first thing I'll do is assign this tire to a new blend. So I'll click the word blend to get a new material. I'll select the tire and go to the blend icon, right mouse, and choose assign material to selection. Then I'll open up the blends attribute editor. Now, since I want a pattern to appear on this tire as a color, I want to map the color. And in fact, a good exercise with this model is to make lettering appear across the side of the tire. For example, we can have the manufacturer's name and the type of tire appear as white text across the sidewall, at the same time having the rest of the tire be a kind of dirty rubber color. So in any case, going back to the material, if I want that, I want to map the color. So I can go to the checkered map button beside color, click that. I'll get the Create Render Node window. And to bring in the bitmap, I need to use File. Now, File is a type of 2D texture. Now, of course, most of the 2D textures are procedural, but File is the one we can bring in the bitmap. So I'm going to click the word File, and there's a file shown in the attribute editor. Now, initially, the file is just black because I have to go and tell the program where to find the image that I want to use. So I can go down the image name, click the little file icon to browse for the file. That brings up the file browser. Now, I've saved out a JPEG you can use for this example, and it's called tire.jpg. That's also in the Chapter 9 folder. So once you find your bitmap, you just click on it. When you click on it, you'll see a swatch or a miniature version in the file browser so you can see what it looks like. Now, Maya supports all the major image formats, and we talked about some of these in a prior video. But for example, you can use a JPEG or a TIFF or a Targa and a number of other formats. In this case, we're just using a JPEG. So once you have your image, you just click on it, select it, and then go down to Open and click Open. And once you click Open, it brings in that bitmap. That bitmap will be listed beside image name, and also you'll see a miniature version of it beside sample. Also, the blend in this case will reflect the change in color, and if you graph network that blend, you'll see the new file node comes in. So just like all the other 2D textures, you have the file node, but you also will have a place 2D texture node. Once again, the place 2D texture node takes care of the tiling. And we'll talk more about tiling in a later video. But for now, the place 2D texture node determines that the repeat UV is 1 by 1. In other words, that file repeats that bitmap one time. All right, so now that the texture is loaded and the color is updated, we can take a look at it. You can render that out or take a look in the view panel. In fact, let's take a look in the view panel. Go ahead and maximize that. And then what I could do is go to shading and make sure smooth shade all is turned on, and also go down to hardware texturing to see a simplified version, hardware texturing. And in fact, there is a lettering on the side of the tire. So on the side of the tire, it's on no other part of the tire. and the rest of the tire is kind of a dirty black. So we can take a look at that texture in more detail inside Maya. Now, of course, you can always go to the hypershade and zoom into the file node, but that's a pretty simplified version of the texture. Another thing you can do is go up to File and go to View Image. You go to View Image, it'll bring up the F-check window, so View Image. Then you can go and locate the file through the file browser. For instance, there's tire.jpg. I'll select that, open, and then F-check will open. And F-check will show you that texture. In this case, it's a 512 by 512 texture, which means it's 512 by 512 in its resolution. And it features kind of a dirty, dark color for the majority of the tire. And then the lettering is laid out in a circle for the wall of the tire. Now again, in order to determine what part of this map appears on what part of the model, UVs had to be prepared. And we'll just take a quick look at that, and then we'll get back to that in more detail later. But if you want to take a look at the UV layout, what you can do is go up to Window, and go to UV Texture Editor. And if the model is selected, for instance, if I select this surface here, you'll see the UV layout. And in fact, you'll see that the tread is on the left here, and the two tire faces are separated. And the tire face that has the lettering is up here, which corresponds to where the lettering was on the bitmap. In any case, all the UVs have to be prepared, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for now, just remember, if you want to bring in a custom bitmap, all you have to do is go to the material and go to the checkered map button, click that and select File, and then search for the image you want to use through the Image Name Browse button. Now you can actually map a bitmap to any of these checkered map buttons. So if you want to use a custom bitmap for transparency or diffuse or something to do with specularity, you're free to do that. In fact, it's often great to map the color with the bitmap and then also map, say, the diffuse with a separate bitmap, and even map something like specular color with the third bitmap. Gives you a lot of control, create a very custom texture.